Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Glasgow Motorway Archive podcast. I'm John.
And I'm Stuart.
How are you, Stuart?
I'm fine. How are you, John?
I'm not too bad. Feels like it's ages since we've been doing this.
Yeah, it feels like weeks and weeks and weeks since we were talking about all those potholes and road defects.
I remember it well.
Yeah.
And that will be a hard act to follow, because if I don't say so myself, I thought that was a pretty good podcast.
That was a great podcast, and it seems to have been very well enjoyed by those who've listened so far. We've had a lot of new followers and listeners come in on the back of it as well, so that's good. It's always a positive. You know, we like talking about things that people can relate to, and potholes are sadly one of those things.
Sadly they are, sadly, yes. But anyway, this time on this episode, what have you got to talk about to follow up on that?
Yeah, okay. So we've been talking a lot recently about subjects that we can discuss in detail, and we were looking at what we had covered, what we hadn't covered, and it suddenly dawned on me that in the 3-4 years we've been doing this, we hadn't actually discussed the Greater Glasgow Transportation Study in any great detail.
Okay.
Now,
we've referred to that.
Oh yeah, many times. And we've spoken to someone who had even modelled it to see if it worked still with congestion and traffic flows and the like. But we've never actually discussed how the report came about, what it found and what it recommended, and how it shaped things. Basically, how it shaped transport policy in the west of Scotland for 50 years.
Yeah, you're using the word transport policy.
Yeah.
Not roads.
No, it's transport. And it's a report that is about all modes of transport.
So could this be our first proper, almost public transport-oriented podcast?
Indeed.
So something different for anyone there who's listening, think, oh, these guys are going to dust off some old books.
Yeah, and we have been encouraged to do this one because there has been a lot of talk recently about future roads and what role roads are going to play going forward.
Of course, yeah.
And there's a lot of incorrect information out there with regards how the system of transport we have, particularly the road network, came about. And I think it's right that we tell the story of how everything came to be, and maybe surprise a few people, with some of the insights on public transport planning and how they were all considered against car ownership as well.
Of course, yeah.
Because there is a bit of a narrative that that's being played out at the moment that implies that everything the city did in the 60s was aligned with private travel. But really, when you dig into this report, you see that that's actually not the case.
Not the case.
And I think people will be interested to hear that. Actually.
I think they will. I mean, I've seen your notes for what you're going to discuss today, and I think it's very interesting, very illuminating on the synergy between the different modes of transport.
Yeah, and I've got a few hardback reports here. We're back to the old school reports, so that's good too.
I wasn't lying. He has dusted off some books.
And dusted off was the word for some of them, because it had been a good few years since I'd really taken real in-depth looks at some of these reports. So
we've got them all digitised now.
I know,
haven't
that's
we?
it. Yeah, So it was good to do a wee deep dive. So GGTS as it's referred to widely. So
all the time we say GGTS. There's a big map of it on your wall.
Yes, there is. In the archive office, we have a huge map of it showing the recommended networks, both highway and rail, and it's fascinating to look at in detail. Now, for those who follow us on Twitter, Facebook and the like, you'll see that we created a new article on the webpage the other day that actually has those maps available to look at, and you can now go on and zoom about and pan about and have a look at the detail behind the junctions and the railways and all that sort of thing. That's something we'd wanted to do for a long time, and it's now finally there. So go on, have a look. www.glasgowmotorwayarchive.org/GGTS-map, and that'll take you to the page.
The full URL.
Yes.
That was great. Okay.
So go on there and have a look, and that will help you to understand some of what I'm going to talk about on this podcast. All right.
Okay.
So this is one of these podcasts where one of us does more talking than the other. So you're going to be listening to me a lot.
Yes, I'm just getting myself comfortable here.
That's not bad.
No, I will be piping up.
Yes. Well, you have a good knowledge of the GGTS as well.
I've written about it, yes, and I've certainly read a lot of the reports and
So-
stuff. But I will, of course, with a lot of these things, there are a lot of people who haven't done this, so I will often cross-examine and ask questions in a way that maybe the listener be like, I would like Stuart to elaborate on that, or why is that?
And that's good.
And the
That's
voice
what
of
we
the people, Stuart. I keep saying this.
Well, I couldn't comment on that at all.
Okay.
So let's get into the origins then of the GGTS. So as our listeners will know, in 1960, Glasgow Corporation commissioned a study into the design and construction of an inner ring road for the city centre. That later grew in scope to become a highway plan for Glasgow.
Yeah, that's the most famous one. When you think of motorways.
Basically came up with a comprehensive plan for a new highway network across the city, and that was within the boundary of Glasgow Corporation as it stood in 1960. Okay, now the corporation and some of the sort of local authorities, adjacent local authorities, so thinking Renfrewshire, Lanarkshire, the boroughs of Coatbridge, Motherwell, Wishaw, those sorts of areas, they saw what Glasgow Corporation were doing. They also had access to money and funds to improve their road networks and other transport systems. And they started to commission their own studies. And because Scott Wilson Kirkpatrick had done such a good job with the highway plan, some of these constituent local authorities, who were all part of the Clyde Valley Planning Group at this stage, started to use Scott Wilson as well for their own. So Rutherglen did, Motherwell did, some other parts, even Clydebank, something to do with the canal. Scott Wilson were involved in all that as well. And what the Scottish Office, or the Scottish Development Department section of the Scottish Office realised was, well, hang on here, all you guys are all doing your own thing. Wouldn't it make sense if we had a single commission that dealt with the entire conurbation?
Yep, the whole area.
Yep, and was led by a steering group made up of representatives from each of these local authorities, and it would make recommendations on a transport network for the conurbation for the next 30 to 35 years. Okay. Now, there was a huge drive towards regionalisation at that time. After the war, and we've spoke about the Abercrombie report and some of the others, there was this drive to try and integrate planning and thinking across the conurbation. Rather than ultra-local planning and consideration, they wanted to open things up. So what someone was doing in Motherwell could have an effect on Dumbarton, and it was felt that it was in everyone's interests to work closely together moving forward. So this drive for regionalisation was very much a big thing, and ultimately led to the creation of the regional councils in 1975, right? So in 1964, this commission got underway. A steering group was set up. It was chaired by the Lord Provost of Glasgow. The first guy was John Johnson, and it started its work just actually as the highway plan work was starting to conclude. Scott Wilson Kirkpatrick, again, were one of the co-authors to this, because they were really the only ones in the area who had the expertise.
It kind of made sense to have that consultant that's consistent, because I always thought the GGTS is like this zoomed out version of the highway plan.
And it is. You're right. You're exactly right. Now, because of some of the other work that had to be done as part of this report, so the scope of it wasn't just to look at a highway network or proposals for a highway network or improvements to what we already had.
Like the highway plan did.
They decided they also wanted it to look at public transport and to get an understanding of how the networks were looking, how well they were used, and what they were likely to look like in the future as things developed. Now, there were plans, this regional thinking, they knew that there was going to be an expansion of the conurbation and new housing built in satellite towns, Castlemilk, Easterhouse, but even further out in areas like Motherwell, Wishaw, Coatbridge, where there was a lot of new council housing getting built.
Cumbernauld.
Yep. We had the new towns at Cumbernauld, we had Erskine coming, we had East Kilbride already well established by this point, and we also potentially had the Stonehouse new town coming down the line as well. So they knew all these things were all happening, and they wanted this joined up plan to link it all together. Okay? It does make sense. It does, but not just from a roads point of view.
Right.
From a transportation point of view. Okay? So the steering group itself, as well as being made up of councillors, also had the backing and the involvement of British Rail. We also had the Clyde Port Authority. There was the Corporation Transport Department for the Underground, and the various local authorities, but also the Scottish Bus Group, who at that time operated the nationalised monopoly bus services like Central Western and all the other, old bus services that
these old organisations that you just don't hear of anymore.
Exactly. So they were all involved in this. So the work began in 1964, as I say, just as the highway plan was starting to wind down. In fact, a decision, I think, was made early on that the work that Scott Wilson had done in Glasgow's road network wasn't going to be revisited. It was going to be more or less incorporated within the wider GGTS. And similarly, any of the advanced work that had already been done in Rutherglen or Motherwell, again, this was going to be integrated in, within the report.
So the point changing things.
Exactly. But it was all going to come together and create this one grand plan. Now, this report, at the time, was the only one of its kind in the UK. One of the first, I believe, in the world, actually, to be done in the way it was. And because it also looked at land use and population and education and where people were going to work and the like going forward, that wasn't really Scott Wilson's bag. That they were great highway engineers and they could make transport proposals. But in terms of population, spread and all that sort of thing, they needed someone else to come in and assist with that. And that was when they brought in the American company, whose name I shall read to you from the front of the book. And they were basically an engineer and architect company based in New York, and they were Tibbets, Abbott, McCarthy, Stratton. Okay.
Right. Okay.
TAMS, as they're referred to in the report.
Yes,
Okay.
because I remember reading TAMS quite a lot in there.
So,
Because I've always thought with these reports, they put a huge emphasis on population forecasting.
yeah. So at one point there was like 100 staff employed just on the Greater Glasgow Transportation Study. They had their headquarters in Queen Street, in Glasgow, in one of the buildings there, and they were conducting masses of work. Because in the old days, of course, this was all before we had access to computers and data. All the data had to be put in manually and on paper,
and collected manually.
Yeah, exactly. So to get an idea of how people were travelling and how they intended to travel in the future and why they were going where they were going, that all had to be done through surveys. So they would survey people in rail stations. They would survey people at bus stops. They would survey people at their homes. They would stop taxis and ask them questions. Commercial vehicles, roadside interviews, all these sorts of things were done over a period of a few years, so in 3 years, from 1964 to 1967, thousands upon thousands of surveys. Now, we actually have copies of some of the original survey papers.
Yeah, I remember we found them.
And it's got still got the free post address and stamp on the front of it, and the people were supposed to fill it in and send it back. And it was basically asking them questions like, how often do you travel? Why do you travel?
Where'd you go?
Where'd you go?
Yeah.
What for? Is it for work? Is it for leisure? Is it for any number of reasons? And basically this was all done, and it was all collated, and it was all fed in to try and prepare this plan. Okay, so they had masses and masses and masses of data. They were making a lot of assumptions, and I mean, you look at volume 1 of the report, and volume 1 basically was the data aspect, the study aspect of the report.
Plan and forecast.
The current travel patterns was volume 1, and I suppose I should say that there were 5 volumes in total. We'll come on to that in a second. But the initial work was focused, as I say, primarily on determining what the existing scenario was and how that was likely to change going forward. So they did all these surveys, they brought it all together, and they actually came up with some really interesting figures. Things I think that surprised some people, particularly in the councils at the time. So they found that in 1964, that the proportion of people using bus services in Glasgow was utilised at something like 117% of based on its population. So that's how many the proportion of people using the bus services available. And when you compared that with the large cities around the world like Paris, London, Tokyo, New York, and others, Glasgow was way, way, way in front in terms of bus patronage.
So, just to get a bit of a thought on that, why do you think that bus patronage was kind of higher of a percentile for Glasgow?
Because Glasgow had low car ownership figures at that time, and there was a dependence on the bus, but also we had a good bus service available. The corporation transport network was particularly good, and I think as well with the trams being taken away in 1962, the people who had used those obviously switched to buses.
Went off. I mean, there is, of course, other things of rail and underground and stuff like that, but quite limited. And so you're saying the bus service was actually quite decent.
The bus service was decent. It was well used. And crucially, it was anticipated that usage would continue. There was always going to be a dependence on bus services in Glasgow and in the conurbation, because it was demonstrated in areas like Paisley and Lanarkshire that actually lots of people depended on the bus to get about. Just for local journeys and local trips.
But I'm kind of putting myself at the state of the conurbation in terms of its provision of road space at the time, is that actually buses work and are reliable at most when there's not a lot of congestion.
Well, that's right. And crucially, one of the things that the report found was that bus service reliability was hindered by congestion on local streets.
I've led you into that.
Yeah,
okay.
So anywhere where we had a major town centre and there was congestion on the existing streets, that affected bus reliability. So morning peak, evening peak services were particularly slow, and the Glasgow city centre services were also particularly slow, and that was one of the the driving factors behind the need to get through traffic, because it was found in Glasgow city centre in 1963. It says in the report that 77% of the traffic on Glasgow city centre streets was through traffic, had no business in the city centre at all.
Yeah, it was somebody going all the way, even from Edinburgh and things like that.
But the nature of the conurbation, as we've discussed many times, is because you've got hills to the north, hills to the south. If you want to go east to west, you have to go through the middle of the conurbation to get out the other end. So you had to go through the city, and that's why all our major trunk roads and some of the other busier A roads all converged either in or very close to Glasgow.
Yeah, I mean, this is an argument against the orbital, so to speak. Yes, you can build those things, but it would be quite difficult to do.
Yeah, exactly. So that all factored into plans, okay? So that's volume 1. So what they did was in volume 2, they took all the various proposals that they had, they come up with, population, people using transport and the like, and started to devise the future plan. Now, I mentioned a bit earlier, and I should make the point now, that there were 5 volumes of the report produced in total. Okay, so volume 1 was the current situation as it was at that time. Volume 2 was the actual forecast and plan. What should we do, when should we do it, and how. Volume 3 was basically all the data that they had collected, the survey results and the findings. That is not really one that's worth looking at. It really is just reams of data. Then, as things started to move forward, one of the key points about this whole plan was it was designed to adapt to the changing situation. Okay, so basically, they appreciated that the situation in 1965 would not perhaps be appropriate in 1975 or 1985. They recognised that. And rather coming up with a rigid plan that said, you must do this based on that information.
By this year. Yeah.
Exactly. It was designed in such a way that it would adapt to the changing economic situation or the employment situation or anything. So what was ultimately being built was adequate for that particular time, rather than how it should have been in 1965.
Got a pragmatic way of looking
ahead
at
of
it.
its time.
And I assume by this logic, we still use the GGTS today for our transport planning.
We'll come on to that later. We will come on to that later. So that was the main reason. So there were reviews of the plan done. So the first review came in 1971, and we had volume 4, which was planning for action. So basically, it was taking the plan from 1968 and actually putting it in a plan. How are we going to build this? What are we going to build first? And this is where it started to weigh up all the options and do the cost-benefit analysis and value for money exercises and things to determine what things should be built first and why. So there were a number of schemes that came out of that. But I'm going to come on to that in a minute. The important thing to note here is that no particular mode of transport was prioritised over another.
That's interesting.
Yes.
Because when we think of these reports, we think all these big blue lines on a map going, oh, look what they could have built.
Yeah. So in 1971, when they were planning this, at that time, we had a committed highway network, but it only contained the M8 route from west to east through the city.
Like what we've got now.
Yeah. Aspects of the Clydeside Expressway and various other bits and bobs. They were all committed schemes. M74 coming in, past Hamilton Bypass, Renfrew Bypass and the M8. The A8 improvement from Bailson to Newhouse, dual carriageway, heading for the new M8 that was being built to the east. The M73. So the base network was committed at that point, but that was really all we had. So that forecasting plan started to look to the next stages of that. Okay, so let's get target 1 finished. What bits do we build next? And they also had a committed public transportation network as well. They knew there were certain things that they wanted to do. The beaching cuts had come in 1964, but in Glasgow, they actually found that between 1960 and 1965, the numbers of people using the train service in the conurbation had increased by 75%.
Well,
huge increase.
And I guess kind of the beaching cuts missed the mark somewhat in Glasgow in that case.
And that was pretty much down to the fact that we were introducing suburban electric services because they were becoming much more reliable and more frequent, and the fares were reasonable.
You weren't coughing away with steam and diesel fumes in a low-level station,
Exactly. So a number of the things that had actually been closed as part of the beaching cuts, thinking of the low-level route through Central Station, thinking the branch to Renfrew, Kirkintilloch, places like that, they were saying, well, hang on a minute here. We actually are showing that there's massive increases in rail usage in the conurbation. There's a demand there. We should reverse these closures and potentially build new stuff as well to accommodate people who wish to travel into the central area by train. So that all starts to factor in to the future reports as well. Okay, I'm going to come back to the actual recommendations and the bits that came out of Volume 2 in a minute. But that plan there in Volume 4, they were really starting to grasp at this and say, this is how we need to move forward. And interestingly enough, the within Volume 4, they knew at that point that there was going to be a regional transportation executive formed, which later became, Strathclyde Transport, Greater Glasgow Passenger Transport Executive as it was initially, then Strathclyde Transport, and of course today SPT. So the GGTS was pushing them towards a regional transport executive. There were further volumes that came along, so we had 4B, which focused on the Glasgow Corporation Transport Underground recommendations. That also came out in 1971. Gives you an indication that they knew the Underground needed a lot of work at that point, because let's be honest, it was pretty much still in its original form at that point.
Almost entirely, yep.
And then we finished off with Volume 5, which was the Transport Investment Programme, which was to cover the period 1978 to 1985. That came in 1974. So that was basically the last report they did. When they knew the regional councils were coming in 1975, they basically said, right, okay, there's no need to have this continuing, Greater Glasgow Transportation Study steering group executive, because these regional councils are going to be so huge. Strathclyde's going to be massive. We're going to have the passenger transport executive will deal with all the public transport proposals, and the regional council itself can deal with the highway proposals. And that was intended to be the future, and that's exactly what happened. We'll come on to what happened thereafter later. Taking us back to Volume 2, pulling all this together, making recommendations. As I said, public transport wise, it was felt it was important to keep it or retain it as an attractive prospect for people. So what the report envisaged was, so first of all, their main justification for the new network of roads and highways, right? Aside from increasing numbers of vehicles on the road, okay, the existing network was congested, particularly in the busy town centre areas, but connections across the conurbation were poor. Now that's not just for private transport; that's for commercial goods and commercial vehicles.
Yeah, because it's not just private transport that uses roads.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So the main justification for the road system, for improvements to the road system, were getting traffic off of local streets and to improve reliability, journey times, accident rates and the like. But that then would have the effect of improving the reliability of the bus services, and they could then introduce...
kind of what I touched on earlier. Yeah.
They could introduce bus priority measures, they could pedestrianised streets, make them safer for people.
Yeah, environmental improvement. Yeah.
So that was the main crux of what they were getting at there.
I see that, yeah. And it's interesting you touched on rail, and I'm sure there's people that if they're into roads are probably into rail as well. Yeah. But there's all kinds of interesting things in these reports of what could have been with that as well.
So what they envisaged was a multimodal, fully balanced transportation system for the west of Scotland.
Roads, buses,
and trains. So what you would do is if you lived in, say you lived in Blantyre in South Lanarkshire.
Okay.
Right? Or you lived, say, 2-3 miles from the train station. Now Blantyre had a good suburban rail connection to Glasgow.
Yes.
If you wanted to work in Glasgow or shop in Glasgow or go out in Glasgow, what they envisaged was there would be a very good feeder bus service that you could get on in your local housing estate or new housing scheme being built by the council.
So it would take you to the railway station.
Take you to the railway station, and you could then get the train into Glasgow. And for people who worked in the city, or for people who were shopping in the city, or people who didn't have access to car, they said that's what we need. And we need to keep that attractive and cheap and accessible for people. Okay? What they also realised and recognised was that more and more people were starting to work a bit further away from their home. And the point is made in the report that as the traditional industries close and things move forward into the service sector, and they already, they knew that was happening with the new developments at Linwood and in West Lothian and in other places at that time. The days of having the skilled labourers and the workforce living a few hundred yards away from the factory or from the shipyard, those days were coming to an end.
Yeah.
If they wanted the skilled labour to get to these new factories,
you'd have to travel miles.
To travel to get there, exactly.
Across the city.
Yeah. And in cases like that, they recognised that travel by private car was probably going to be the most attractive option.
Well, the cars were up and coming.
Yes.
At that point in the 60s and 70s.
Yes. Exactly. The other thing they tried to do was design a system that catered for what the situation would potentially look like in 30 years' time. So they were looking at what the population and traffic flows and the like would be in 1990. It was then later revised to the year 2000 as things moved on, because there was no point designing a road network that would accommodate 1965 levels of traffic.
That's something we need to emphasise. Yeah, is it's forecasting, as you say, right up to the year 2000. You know, which actually is quite unheard of in a lot of ways now with transport. They don't look so far ahead, but back then they did. They went, actually, we're going to have to make this work for the next 40 years.
Well, that's it. I mean, they were spending the equivalent of hundreds of millions of pounds today on new roads proposals and transport proposals, and there would be no point in building something that was only going to work for 5 years, because they knew that the growth in motor traffic was going to be huge, and likewise even for the movement of goods and the movement of goods was coming off the railways. So although we were saying in Glasgow that passenger traffic was increasing, should be noted that freight traffic on rail had gone through the floor as it had switched to HGVs on the roads.
Exactly.
And again, with these new developments in places that weren't near traditional railway lines, like Linwood and West Lothian and Hunterston and places like that, they didn't all have great access to rail. You know?
Because that's one of the things in the UK in general, right? If we look at the railway network, a lot of it, the network was built in kind of Victorian times, and it's quite rare we build a brand new railway line on a completely new alignment. You had all this stuff there, but of course, where you're building a new town, as you say, you actually don't.
And these developments and new town developments in particular led them to focus on this, the passenger aspect of rail travel, and propose, as I mentioned earlier, reopening some of the beaching lines, retaining others, opening new stations that had never existed before, and actually proposing some other rail schemes that they felt would make a big difference. So thinking about some of the things in Volume 2 that they recommended, so the Kilmacombe line that ran from Greenock to Paisley,
which would have gone by, I think that goes, I mean, it's still there, but it's not open, obviously. Then it went to Bridge of Weir, went to Elderslie.
That's right, yeah.
This service now would be so beneficial.
Yeah, now, I believe that service only closed in the 1980s, but it had been a fight, I believe, to keep it open for years.
I know there's a campaign group around there who really, really want that open again.
Even in this report, they were saying then this route should be maintained. The Paisley Canal line was another one that they were saying should be reopened. It had only recently closed at that stage.
That's right. It reopened in the 90s,
I think so, yeah. Strathclyde Transport reopened that one. They also recommended the branch line to Renfrew being reopened because Renfrew was going to be building a lot of new houses.
Exactly. Renfrew didn't have a railway station.
Yeah. Kirkintilloch was another one that had lost its branch line, so they wanted to reopen that. Interestingly, Crossrail gets its first mention in this report. Because
so as far back as 1967, they were talking about Glasgow Crossrail. Yeah,
because they knew the St Enoch station was closing and the Buchanan station were closing. They wanted to consolidate everything in Queen Street and Glasgow Central. So a good way of allowing services from the south to connect to the north without having to go via these stations.
Which is a criticism at the moment.
Yes.
Yep.
So Crossrail, as we now know it, was first mentioned in this report. And a huge number of new stations were proposed, actually, some of which have happened, some which haven't. So the most high-profile one, I think, that I found that hadn't happened was Blythswood Square.
Oh, not a place you'd think you'd have a station.
So they recommended a station there, but then there was a lot of offices in that part of the city centre. So Blythswood Square was recommended to have a station. The connection at the Mercat building.
Yes, well, that was going to be part of the Crossrail scheme.
Yes, because there is Glasgow Cross.
Glasgow. Well, there's a railway line that's still there to this day, and it was a City Union line or something like that. But they use that for moving rolling stock just now. It's not. But that is a perfect example, and I believe that the latest Crossrail plans, and when I say latest, by the way, there's an asterisk next to that, they've been around for a while, is that they would use that by the Mercat building. That is interesting.
Yeah, so that was going to link in with the reopened Glasgow Central Low Level, which was also a key part of this proposal.
That's right, which we know now as the Argyll line.
That's right.
Yeah.
Sitting alongside all this, they had a proposal to upgrade the underground. Now, not to expand the underground, just to modernise the underground.
Get rid of the Victorian era type,
and have passenger hubs at places like Partick and St Enoch and all these areas which were close to other major modes of public transport. So that all came about as a result of this as well. So basically what we ended up with was a report that recommended a whole load of new roads for various reasons, an expanded rail network for obvious reasons, and a bus system that was considered reliable for local journeys and for also connecting people to other modes of public transport.
Yeah, I mean, just to talk about buses for a second, we talk about these feeder systems, but I seem to remember looking into the bus services there, but they also looked at a number of brand new bus hubs and stations in and around Glasgow as well, which...
That's right.
You know, there used to be a bus station in Anderston that they're not. Was that maybe something that came out of that on Buchanan bus station there?
Yeah, so I think the Anderston bus station certainly was mentioned. That replaced the old, was it the old Waterloo Street bus station? Or what's the other one down there? Bovill Street. There was an old bus garage down there, I believe, that the Anderston one replaced. That's certainly referenced in the report. Also, other bus stations in places like East Kilbride and Hamilton and places like that. I actually forgot to mention as well that express bus services are mooted as being something that should be introduced.
So when you say express bus, you mean like a coach that goes on the motorway?
So an interurban bus service. And the main ones they speak about in there are like Erskine and Paisley to Glasgow, Cumbernauld to Glasgow, East Kilbride to Glasgow, Motherwell to Glasgow, Coatbridge to Glasgow. But crucially, these would all utilise the motorway network because they would become a reliable service for people.
Just like the bus you used to go to work you used to go to work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it was said that people who maybe didn't have access to the car or who didn't want access to the car would be able to use, if they weren't near a rail station or they didn't want to use a feeder bus, they would have access to express buses as well. But a new road network was crucial for that. Okay. Now it has to be, we have to state again that, and this is something we're asked about a lot, that the road system itself, and if you go on the webpage and you have a look, the ultimate road system was really quite extensive.
Looking at it now.
Yeah.
Yep.
And it had a number of ring roads and radials, and it was designed basically to link up every corner of the conurbation to maximise economic benefit. So someone in Mulgai could go to work in Hamilton and get there quickly and effectively by
goods
car
could move around freely. There was a lot of redundancy built into the system. So if that was closed or there was an incident there, you could take this other spoke or, part of the ring to go somewhere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was all about ultimately improving communications across the conurbation.
I like that word.
And the rail system and the bus system were going to be an equal and important part of that.
That's it. They weren't just tagged on.
No.
You know what I mean? So that's it.
Exactly.
And I wonder, it's something it's been a while since I've looked at the GGTS, but I wonder if Park and Ride was ever thought of or came out of some of these things.
That is a good point, actually, and I'm glad that you've mentioned that. Because
that wasn't in your notes.
No, that wasn't in my notes, and it probably should have been.
Right.
Yes, there is a mention of Park and Ride. Not Park and Ride as we know it, but what they did say was that some of the stations had space available where parking provision could be introduced so that people could park at the station. So rather than use the feeder bus service, you could park there and then take the train in to work.
I am a massive fan of Park and Ride because I see it as the solution in a lot of ways to getting traffic out of towns, because people aren't going to give up their cars entirely because they need to use them on the weekend and they're locked into a 5-year deal paying £400 a month. So you can still use your car, and then you can go to this station, you can park for free, and then you can use whatever service to go. And it works well in Edinburgh.
Yeah. Now, this is the other thing that comes into the report. There was no unconstrained allowance for traffic growth.
No, and they acknowledged.
It's acknowledged in the report
Yes.
that the network, as proposed, would be it. No widening, no expansion. That's what the conurbation would get. Now, to temper the amount of people using cars to go into the central area in particular, this is where the proposal came for restrictions on parking. So prior to 1965, when on-street parking controls came into Glasgow, there was something like 50,000 curbside spaces or something available across the entire city. They knew that they had to reduce that and control that. So by bringing in the parking meters and stuff and encouraging only short-term stops at the curbside, they introduced the parking garages, as they called them, multi-storey car
parks. What we call multi-storey,
They introduced a number of those around the periphery of the city centre. The theory being you would come off the motorway and that's where you would stop. You would not drive. There would be no need for you to drive into the city centre.
I think, was the highway plan, did that not moot a lot of this too? And it was just expanded upon by the GGTS.
Yeah, exactly. And if the ring road had been completed in various other parts of the system, you would have had a network of parking garages and multi-storey car parks all the way around the city centre. 2 in the south, 3 in the east. The 2 in the north we have already, Cowcaddens and Concert Square, and then the 2 in the west, Cadogan Street and Charing Cross, and these things were all being, brought in to discourage people from driving in. But it's stated in the report, it's interesting, that they say that if you're going to keep your public transport networks and links to the city centre viable and attractive, you need to introduce controls. The parking rates have to be at a level that make it less attractive to drive than it would be to use public transport.
Because you can imagine a bus not being able to stop anywhere or blocking the road and everything. Although interruption now, they like that. But back then they want,
they did not build the motorway system so people could drive to work in Glasgow city centre. Mm-hmm. That's simply not the reason it was built. It was to improve connectivity about the entire conurbation. Mm-hmm. So they never wanted people actively to be commuters into the city centre in particular, you know. It was never really about that. The public transport element was always the preferred modes for the city centre. And that then fed into the decision-making that came down the line. So as we moved into that Volume 4 era in the early 70s and they started making decisions about what to build next, okay, so early on they made the decision that the Argyll line was going to reopen, as we know it. They were going to electrify more of the rail network, the air line, the Reims Bay line, East Kilbride, all these other things. They were going to do all that as well.
I think we're still working on East Kilbride, we've managed, and even Paisley Canal's been electrified now.
So they were going to electrify more lines. Okay, they were going to build the road system, and they were also looking obviously at improvements to the bus service. And the decisions started to be made, and they started weighing them all up. So they had the committed road network, and they had the one or two transport proposals. So they started weighing up options against one another, and the ones that stand out for me are comparing the upgrade of the underground against the Maryhill motorway, right? And the decision was that the underground modernisation would go ahead first as a priority because of the benefits that would come back from that, and to ensure that remained viable.
The thing with the underground, fantastic book, and I know you've read it, is that it was the service and the quality of it, because it was so run down. Ridership was actually dropping on it.
And a lot of the stations that were there were servicing industry that was no longer there, and a lot of the tenements were being removed from areas, particularly Kinning Park and areas like that. And they knew that they had to tweak it to keep it viable. You know, going forward.
Absolutely. So, they moved one station. I mean, Partick Station's actually being moved. It used to be called Merkland Street, and it's just round the corner or something.
To create that new transport hub.
Yeah, if you look out the window of the subway train when you go by, you can still see the old station chamber. It's quite cool. I thought to put that little tidbit in there.
Yeah,
the underground modernisation is a good thing. Thank goodness we did get that, and I know it's been ongoing. There's a kind of an eternal upgrade that's going on at the moment.
Yep. So we had a whole list of projects that they wanted to take forward as their second part. Now this is how things change, and they change very quickly, economically and politically, as we know now looking back. So when Volume 2 was published in 1968, basically the Scottish Office told them that there would be the equivalent of £15 billion available for transport investment over the 35-year period. Okay, so when they were proposing all these big schemes, they assumed that the money was going to be available. So I think they said something like 465 million was going to be available for highways, 385 million was going to be available for public transport, and that was guaranteed over a period of time. Now, as we know, when the 70s came along, that was entirely upended.
Yeah, early to mid-70s, that's right, because of the oil crisis.
Exactly. Now, things never recovered from that, as we know now, looking back. So if you're sitting in 1965 or 1968 and they say to you, you've got 15 billion available over the next 35 years for transport, we will guarantee it.
You will go and fill your boots.
So they're sitting and they're starting to plan ahead. So that's why they were able to say comfortably, we're going to do the underground first because of the maximum return. And we'll come back to the Maryhill motorway after 1978.
Because obviously we'll still want the Maryhill motorway at that point.
And we'll still have the cash available.
Exactly.
And likewise, it was the same with the Argyll line was balanced against the Johnston bypass and the Springburn Expressway and the first phase of the Ayr and Stirling motorways. And the Argyll line was prioritised over all of those. Yeah.
So if you think, oh, you know what, I really wish they'd done this and that on the road, then you wouldn't think it actually would come at the cost of that.
So the underground modernisation got to go ahead and went ahead. The Argyll line got to go ahead, went ahead. There was one or two additional roads things that did happen. So obviously with the completion of the M8, we had the Dumbreck Road connection and one or two other wee bits of bobs that did go ahead.
The first part of the M77.
Yes, yeah. And barely anything else really. And by the time they had moved forward with the the public transport proposals.
Yeah.
Then the regional councils came into being, the steering committee ceased to exist, but the financial situation had completely changed. And
Oh dear.
public sentiment had changed regards road construction in some cases, particularly the urban sections
That's right.
of the motorway system. But what that had the effect of doing was, so they were conscious already that there were aspects of the motorway system that were proven controversial. And what they sought to do was, because they had this proposed network of roads, they could rebalance the system by building, say, the Northlink motorway or the Paisley Motherwell Cumbernauld motorway, and provide some more radial routes and adjust some alignments. So you would still have had more road space available for the increasing traffic and for improving connections and the like, but perhaps reevaluating some of your other parts of the plan, like the east flanks of the ring road and the like. But because the financial situation had changed so much, that Strathclyde, when they came in, and I think they inherited something like 30 road schemes and a number of other public transport schemes, because the money wasn't available, they had to whittle that right down, and the vast majority of them were shelved. So I think like the Ayr motorway, the M77, the M80 still in motorway, parts of the Springburn Expressway.
Because we didn't see a lot of this until the 90s, like
the
M80
M74 extension, that would have been Hamilton motorway at that time, the Crow Road Expressway, parts of Great Western Roads, the Northlink motorway, the Lomond motorway, the East Link, the South Link. These schemes were all shelved overnight. You know, they all went away. And likewise with the public transport, you know, although the passenger transport executive came in, they were initially happy because they had the Argyll line and the underground modernisation to work on, and they knew that the Ayr line electrification and the like was coming down the line. But eventually they started to realise as well that their grand plans for more and more weren't going to happen quickly or easily either. And I think actually it was really the 80s and the late 80s in some cases before they were able to start making some improvements.
The Johnston bypass and all these kind of things, the road improvements came thick and fast in the time of the late 80s, early 1990s.
Yeah. So, you know, the report itself, although it's never going to fulfil its original recommendations, it's never going to get anywhere near it, both from either a roads perspective or a public transport perspective, it did still shape policy across the conurbation for basically for 50 years.
Quite forward thinking in a lot of ways, you know, the way they looked at public transport and other things. Now, let's, I know you might have more to say on this, but if we think about, say, an equivalent study that one might do for an area like this, or maybe across an entire country, there is something in these newer studies which is very absent from the GGTS, and that's the whole active travel thing. So we use a new term for this. It's a new term, I think it's called, is it walking, wheeling?
And cycling.
Walking, wheeling and cycling, that's it. And that's all about, you know, and that's built in with climate and green and all this.
And health as well.
And health, of well-being of people, because it's healthier to go out and cycle and this and that. So was there anything like that you ever came across? Because all I found was the word environment was used, but it meant a different thing back then. It wasn't about a green thing. It was, you know, improving the area, and people could walk to the shops and do this. Because new towns in particular had a big thing about having people walking about freely.
You're right, and pedestrians and cyclists in particular do get mentioned in the reports. But
cyclists get mentioned.
Yes, but only about improving the situation for them from an accident point of view, from a safety point of view.
Right, I see.
It wasn't about providing it for, say, for health reasons, as like we say today, encouraging people to cycle because it's you know, more climate friendly or it's better for your well-being and for your health. No, obviously no mention of that at all. They were more concerned about providing new routes for people that were safer, that were taking you away from cars. The main way they were going to achieve that was by getting cars off local roads and onto these new limited access motorways. Alexandra Parade is probably the best example.
Yeah, because you've got the Monkland.
When the M8 motorway opened, Alexandra Parade emptied. Prior to that, it was the main route to Edinburgh from Glasgow.
It's now a cycling paradise. Yeah.
And I suppose really coming 50 years, 60 years later, they have kind of allowed for it because the road system, by taking the traffic away from the city centre and some of the residential areas, it's allowing Glasgow to take forward proposals like the avenues and things like that. Because
that would be a pipe dream if you didn't have the M8. Yeah, I know.
You know what I mean? Because because 77% of traffic in the city centre in 1960 was through traffic.
Yeah.
Take the motorways away, that's not going to change. Things are still moving about the conurbation.
The problem. There is this thing. I know you mentioned this at the beginning.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of talk about, you know, how we're going forward with transport, what place roads and motorways have. Now, can I just tell you, there is a phenomenon that some people quote as this traffic evaporation. it's ridiculous. That is not going to happen. I mean, if you were to shut the motorways, guys, there'd be chaos not just for weeks but for years, and it would economically stifle the city and also make a lot of these roads that were previously traffic free really unpleasant.
Yeah, because
so we do owe a lot to this in a way.
It's like you can only consider these options once you have actual measures in place to reduce demand and reduce the amount of vehicles on the road. So, the way to do it is to say we'll get 20% less traffic on the road, and there'll be various ways that you can achieve that. That's when you start thinking about changing what you have built or what you have available.
Yeah.
You don't do that first and then just hope that it will make the problem go away, because it won't.
Yeah, and we're actually, we're not there yet, with a lot of that as well. Yeah. There's a lot of change and different things that we're going to come. We've spoken about this before, about autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, and all kinds of measures, that are coming now more than future.
So
we're doing it that long.
This is a report that shaped transport policy for 50 years.
Yeah,
more than 50 years, but it wasn't perfect. And we've discussed this before.
My criticism of it, and remember we spoke to John about this, is it was too ambitious, because it had the data to back it up, but they did get the population figures wrong.
Yes. So they assumed, I believe, an ultimate population in the conurbation of 3 million.
Which we've not got now.
They assumed that city centre population, or Glasgow population, was going to remain somewhere around the million mark, which it dropped way, way, way off of.
Because you all went to the new towns, and people moved out of the city centre to, nice new modern housing.
The other thing apparently about it, and apparently all the surveys done in the same way across the UK and Europe and the world at the same time suffered from the same thing, that the data was not transferable into different situations. The way that they interviewed people and collected information was only valid for that particular situation at that particular time. It didn't really help them to predict things down the line. So if they wanted to make changes in 5-10 years, they would need to do a whole load of surveys again.
Of course they did.
They couldn't adapt the data as part of the predictions, and that's kind of where it fell down. The population figures really did let it down. Where it did actually come out quite good on was the predictions of usage of the various forms of transport. So its rail projections are pretty spot on.
Yes.
Its road traffic predictions are within a few percentage points of where they actually ended up in 1990. I think John Cullen says in his book it's like 3%, of a difference. It's pretty good in that case. But also the land use as well. So, in terms of the role of some areas, obviously they assumed, and I was when I read this, and you're reading it in this 1960s way.
You have to.
It's sad. It's quite sad, because now we're looking back 40 years on when they're talking about. They assumed in the 1980s, in Volume 2, that there would be more jobs than there were people in the conurbation. Therefore, more people would be travelling into the conurbation from the east and from Ayrshire and elsewhere, and they would need transport to do that. Now, 1980s Glasgow, no, there were not more jobs than there were people.
The country was undergoing its deindustrialisation, to use a soft word for it at that point. Yeah.
So there are things that because this optimism, this 1960s optimism, everything's great, everything's going to be great forever now. We've turned a corner, we've come out of the war, the world is a better place. We're going to move forward. We're going to
never
drive
quite
Glasgow forward
rekindled
together.
that, did we?
No. So all that optimism died off very quickly in the early 70s, and it's never come back. And it's a shame, because the report really is of its time. When you read the language and the optimism of it, that yes, we will have the equivalent of 15 billion available for transport investment, and this is what we're going to do with it. And the change in public sentiment toward particular sections of the motorway system aside, let's be honest, the East Flank of the Inner Ring Road is controversial. Building the Paisley to Hamilton motorway through rural South Glasgow was never going to be controversial, because it was all through farmland and the like. Had they proposed that in 1970, nobody would really have batted an eyelid about that.
Maybe they should have put their efforts into that rather than this East Flank, which was never going to happen.
Yeah. So I think their prioritisation of certain parts of the road system was probably a bit flawed. I think the emphasis should have been on some of these other radials first. That's kind of why we've ended up with the corridor that we have now, but it's all filtered through the city, because they and I suppose really, in fairness to them, they were providing roads in the busiest places first. They needed instant relief, the quickest relief to areas that they could find.
Yeah, if we think about a lot of those areas and that kind of that southwest kind of corner of the as you say, conurbation or metropolitan area, at the time, a bit smaller.
Yeah, I know, exactly. So it's easy for us to say, oh, we really need that Paisley Hamilton Cumbernauld motorway.
Yeah, but back then maybe it wasn't the case.
At that stage, had they built that at that stage, there would probably have been very little traffic actually using it.
Yeah.
You know? So you have to put yourself, as we always say, you have to put yourself in the context of the time. You know?
So one thing I'd say is be quite grateful for what you have in this situation, because you can end up in situations of other places which will not be mentioned where none of the modes have been catered for particularly well, or one mode has been very catered for, while others have fallen apart. Now, not every city is the same. Glasgow's had this kind of benefit from being quite an industrious place and undergoing a lot of redevelopment that enabled the roads to come.
Yes.
You know what I mean? But be grateful on it, you know.
I'm sure people will be, John.
So that's what I think is a lot of people quite harsh about the M8 and other things and so on, but, you know, it is what it is.
Yeah, so there was a lot of work done. It probably, I reckon, and John Cullen was certainly of the opinion that it remained the largest single transportation study ever undertaken in Scotland, because it looked at all modes in all parts of the conurbation, both local authority and trunk road. You know, it looked at... There was
loads of schemes in there, and they reappear bobbing up now and again in the equivalent kind of Strathclyde reports. What's the is it the TPP or whatever it is? Or that's it. I've got it right, haven't I? Yeah.
Transport policy priorities.
That came with Strathclyde, where they just kind of lifted some of these out of there.
Exactly.
Do you think to this day, Stuart, do these books ever get dusted off at the people who in pay grades a lot higher than us that maybe go, oh my goodness, yes, we should do something like that? There must be something that's still being mooted now.
I think it's obvious that for until at least the late 1990s that was the case, because there were people still employed in the local authorities and in the Scottish
who remember
office,
all this,
who knew that a lot of work had been done, groundwork had been done in this, and they would dust off certain proposals now and again and have a look at it. It's pretty obvious that the Passenger Transport Executive, SPT Strathclyde, used the groundwork done here to determine what they built when they were in existence, thinking of the Paisley Canal and the new stations.
There's also the what is it they call the Annie's? Is it Annie's Land Line or the Kelvin line?
Kelvin Dale. So there was a station there proposed.
Mary Hill Line. Yeah. That's what it's called.
So
and it goes from
this is all in this list, you know. I mean, there's a list of new stations that were proposed here, and I've put a marker here. So some examples. Oh, an East Kilbride Town Centre train station. Well, that's never happened. But Strathclyde wanted to build one.
Can I bring up the urban legend?
No, don't bring that up again. You've brought that up before, have you?
Because East Kilbride's station at the moment, the railway station, is quite far from the shop. You have to walk like kind of 10 minutes or something, but there is space allowed somewhere in East Kilbride for this station.
I read somewhere before, and it is out there somewhere, that when the shopping centre was built in East Kilbride, that space was left below it to allow for a future rail connection to
now, whether or not that's a void or something, we'll never know.
I don't know. Any other new stations here? Milton, Motherwell South, well, that happened eventually, is Airbles, Proven Mill, Red Road, Staub Hill, Trongate, that would have been Glasgow
Trongate,
Cross,
that's right next to the cross, isn't it?
Kirkintilloch was a reopened. Kelvindale, that happened. Hawkhead, that reopened eventually.
Yeah, Hawkhead's on the canal line.
That's on the canal line. Blytheswood Square, Alexandra East. Yeah, there's tons in here. Bella Houston. You know, they had a lot of proposals in here. You know, for that. So it's quite obvious that it did shape things. Yeah. You know, going forward, and certainly it did on the roads, although they had to rework some. Like the M74 was also eventually realigned.
It was
to cater for the fact the ring road was cancelled. So yeah, it's an interesting read. I mean, we have got it digitised. The intention is that they will be available to read at some point in the future on the website. I'm sure people will appreciate being able to look at it in detail. All 5 volumes. You know, we have all 5 volumes. We're quite lucky. And there were hundreds of technical memos produced. We've got excellent technical memos on the Shettleston Expressway, the Ayr Motorway, Stirling Motorway, Great Western Road Expressway, the first one that got cancelled, the Kelvindale Expressway. What's the ones in the south? Pollockshaw's Road and the like, Clarkson Expressway, Kilmarnock Express. We've got all those technical memos. Very grateful.
Kilmarnock Express was very interesting because we came across that relatively recently, and then with all the cut and covered tunnels in it.
Glasgow City Council were clearing out an old depot, if you remember, a few years ago, and got in touch and said, "We've got all these old technical memos here. We don't want them. They're going to the bin.
Yes,
Do you want
please.
Them?"
Yes, straight in the scanner.
Scooped them all up. So we've got all that as well. So we actually have access to a lot of the data as well, and their considerations at the time. It's fascinating.
That's really good.
Yeah, I hope people have found this interesting. It's been a bit talky. It's been a bit heavy on details and the like.
Next thing, I think what we need to do is get one of those straws for you to drink out of, so you can drink and then you can keep talking at the same time.
Exactly.
Because you have done a lot of talking,
Yeah.
but it's been really, really, really informative. So
Yeah.
So
the main thing I would say to people to take away from this: the next time you hear someone saying that the 1960s was all about car provision, that might have been the case in some parts of the UK, but it most certainly was not in the Glasgow conurbation.
Mm-hmm.
Public transport was very well used in Glasgow and in its surrounding areas. They wanted to maintain that, and the car was supposed to balance against that finally. And indeed, as I've pointed out, actually some public transport schemes went ahead over some of the road proposals. As well.
Just one right at the end. Do you know why they didn't dual the A737 all the way down to Beath? And
go on, tell us that one, because that was a really good story that we get told on that.
It was because of the upgrade and the electrification of the railway line.
Yeah.
That got prioritised instead. Actually, we should do that, and that meant that the A737 past Gilbarkin was single carriageway.
Originally, it was supposed to be dualled near enough all the way to Beath, but when they decided, I remember I was being told that story, that they decided that they would enhance the bus service to the station. They built they electrified the line, so therefore they could justify only building the second half of the Kilbarkin bypass, whatever it's called, Johnson Linwood bypass, as single carriageway. So even in the 80s and the 90s, that was still factoring in.
Yeah.
All right.
There you go.
But I've got nothing more to say. I think I've said everything I need to say on this.
I? Well, we'll have listen. It's been good, Stuart. So you've clearly got this condensed. It was a massive amount of information you've had to condense into that.
You could talk about these reports for days with the amount of information that's in them, especially the later ones that really are quite fascinating. I mean, there's schemes in some of the later volumes, like the one that always fascinates me, the Bells Hill Motherwell Wishaw Expressway, being a Lanarkshire guy, the Wishaw Link to the M74, to replace Garrion Bridge. That really fascinates me. I'd love to get into the detail of some of those. Maybe someday we will.
What the sad thing is with these is that these small schemes that you talk about, sometimes they're just a paragraph. That's all we know. We don't know there aren't any maps or anything, just things that are kind of mooted at the time.
And that was the thing, of course, that from the Scottish Office point of view, and I will finish on this point.
Okay.
To the Scottish Office, who were looking to fund it, when the money started to dry up, they then started prioritising schemes of national importance and left the local authorities to get on with the schemes of regional importance. Whereas prior to 1975, the Scottish Office would have given grant assistance to any schemes. So like the Wishaw Motherwell Bells Hill Expressway is only of regional or local importance.
It's local importance, and then they would given
So if it'd been 1972, they would probably get a 75% grant for it. But when the money dried up, it was never going to happen, so the local authority would need to have funded it itself, and that's why most of these schemes never happened. It wasn't that they were ever cancelled, it was just that they were simply unaffordable to the local authorities.
It's what it often comes down to, I'm afraid.
And there's so many schemes and plans within GGTS that are, that fell victim of that,
Yeah, the purse strings, indeed.
So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. God, I think we've got about 50 odd now that are available via Podbean, Apple Podcasts, and the like. If you do enjoy them, remember to leave us a rating and tell people what you think. It's always good to get new followers. And hello to any of the hundreds or so of new followers that have joined us since July.
Yep, hello. And also, let's talk about social media, because it's been me that's been doing it the last couple of weeks.
Oh, yes.
That's why it's been really good. I don't know who's up on the rota next after me, but please go and check us out on Facebook. Have a look at Instagram as well, and we're of course on Twitter, where we're sharing all of these things that we speak about. So give us a like, get in touch on that.
And the website does continue to develop as well. Things have been a bit slow the last few months because we've been digitising like mad in the background.
It's been very hands-on actually with the motorway stuff, because of the digitising and moving stuff about. It's not much time for that.
And lots of new records that we've received as well that all will be revealed soon. So we'll get back to the website soon, and there are some other big things coming up as well that we'll tell you about nearer the time.
Okay, looking forward to it.
On that note, goodbye for now.
Goodbye, thank you.